Hello, everybody. I'm Terrence Rajun, the manager of 192 Books, and we are here to celebrate the release of Fail Better, Reckonings with Artists and Critics by Hal Foster, who I'm standing in front of. Published by MIT Press 2025, and he'll be speaking with Ben Lerner. Thank you to Paula Cooper Gallery and the Sarah Charles Wirt Studio. Fail Better. In these 40 texts, Foster reviews artists from Richard Hamilton and Jasper Johns to Gerhard Richter and Ed Ruscha. Considers contemporaries from Louise Lawler and Cindy Sherman to Jeremy Duller and Adam Pendleton, and traces the development of criticism since the early 1960s, with essays on such influential figures as Susan Sontag, Rosalind Krauss, and institutions like Art Forum magazine and the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. Taking his title from Beckett, Try Again, Fail Better, Foster notes that an essay is always an attempt, more or less failed. Critics fail artworks because there can never be a definitive reading. Art fails its historical moment because it cannot resolve the contradictions that prompt it. But in these failures, Foster finds historical consciousness, and with it, it's a future work, future illumination. Hal Foster is a Townsend Martin class of 1917, professor of art and archaeology at Princeton University. He is the author of What Comes After Farce and Brutal Aesthetics, among other books. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he co-edits October and writes regularly for the London Review of Books. Ben Lerner is the author of 8 books of poetry and prose, as well as several collaborations with visual artists. His most recent book of poetry, The Lights, was published last fall by FSG, and his most recent novel, The Topeka School, won the Los Angeles Times Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He has received fellowships from the Fulbright, Guggenheim, and MacArthur Foundations, among other honors, and is a distinguished professor of English at Brooklyn College. Nearly all the books I listed are available outside in the hallway for sale and at 192 Books. And I thought I would end by indulging in reading the paragraph of know-how on that Fail Better is from. First the body, no. First the place, no. First both. Now either, now the other. Sick of the either, try the other. Sick of it, back to sick of the either. So on. Somehow on, till sick of both, throw up and go. Where neither, till sick of there, throw up and back, the body again, where none, the place again, where none, try again, fail again, better again, or better worse, fail worse again, still worse again, till a sick for good, throw up for good, go for good, where neither for good, good and all. Thank you. I'll pass it to Ben.
Thank you, Terrence. Do I introduce you? No, you just start talking.
No, enough with the introductions.
Yeah, enough with the introduction.
Not an up guy, that Samuel Beckett. Thank you, Terrence, for arranging this, and to the gallery for hosting, and for all of you for coming, and for Ben for being here. It's a little daunting. Ben's like the smartest person I know. Plus, many of the ideas in the book are, in fact, his. We do art tours every month with our pal, Jeff Dolvin, and I rip them off. I bet a good number of you are here to listen to him, so I promise not to go on too much. I owe special thanks to Paula Cooper, the legend. Her gallery has been a primary site of my art education ever since I was a college kid in the mid-1970s. I hung out often in her space on Worcester Street in the 80s, out of respect for her critical selection of the art, of course, but also because I had a crush on her. We all did. In the current calamity, my writing seems even more trivial than usual. But then part of our response must be to keep on with our work, to continue to engage each other, to argue, to laugh, whatever. That's about the best I can do as a pep talk right now. If the conversation takes a political turn, great, it's fine with me. Over to you, friend.
This is an amazing book, Hal. Congratulations on it. It's really terrific.
God, you were so grumpy just a minute
No,
or so
no.
ago.
So I have like a series of questions, all of which are probably too big, but maybe you can help me narrow them down. But I thought we could start at the end of the book, in part because the end of the book, the last essay in the book, is about a beginning. It's about the anti-aesthetic, the anthology, the influential anthology you edited a little more than 40 years ago. And the last essay in this volume thinks about the anti-aesthetic then and now. You were what? You were 28 or something when you, yeah. And now you're 33. No, and but I want to ask. I want to begin by asking about that impossible but inevitable word, the aesthetic, and what it meant for you then when you were working on that anthology, and why it was important to you and your cohort to be oriented against it. And maybe you could say something about how that word figures for you now, how the aesthetic works for you now, or how it's undergone changes of phase.
Yikes. Okay. Thanks for the easy question to begin with. I think, well, part of it is just the pretension of a kid new to New York and completely overwhelmed by new art, new theory. And also, I think, stunned by a political turn. I mean, this is the beginning of neoliberalism. This is Reagan, Thatcher, etc. But why the anti-aesthetic? I think I almost equated the aesthetic with the ideological then, because I almost took too much to heart the definition of ideology given to us, given to my generation by Althusser, which is ideology is a magical resolution of a real contradiction. And that seemed very close to the aesthetic, especially as Kant gave it to us as this kind of place of judgment that could be a site of reconciliation of different kinds of judgments. So, but that, I mean, that's the philosophical, conceptual frame. I equated them too quickly. But this was also a time, this is 1983, when the aesthetic was back with full force after lots of extraordinarily critical experimental art in the 1960s and 70s. We were suddenly hit almost in time with the neoliberal, neoconservative turn, with a neo-aesthetic turn, with neo-expressionism, postmodern architecture. It was everywhere. So it had the anti-aesthetic for me had a critical force. I was suspicious of the very idea of the aesthetic, but it also had a critical imperative in relation to practices in art and architecture that I wanted to contest, and I was not alone at all. And yeah, I mean, again, a lot of it was also hubris. But what does it mean for me now? Well, I think who cares what it means for me? I think it in a way, it has a different place now. If you slip over from the aesthetic to the beautiful, that too was a word of contempt for many of us. And we really attacked it. Again, it seemed to be too much about reconciliation, too much about distraction from the world, from politics. And we were, much more inclined to the sublime, and we wanted to somehow allow for the traumatic, the traumatic in our subjectivity and history and society. But in a way, the sublime is too much with us. We're too overwhelmed now. The traumatic is kind of given to be the truth of everything. And one understands why so many artists and writers, indeed critics, want to seek an exit from that kind of sublime, traumatic nexus, recourse to the beautiful. And I'm not entirely on board, but I also understand it. And so it's not about what I think, it's just how I see it positioned differently in aesthetic practice.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think in the book about an artist who's interested in beauty, who you celebrate. Maybe Adam Pendleton, actually, in a way.
Yeah, Richard Hamilton, for sure. I think there's, Sarah Charlesworth. Here we are in the midst of her extraordinary work. I mean, she's very interested in beauty, but she also, as was typical of our generation, wanted to step back from it and see how it was motivated and manipulated, and to be critical about it too. But I think she's all in on the aesthetic and all in on the beautiful. But also, as you look at her work, you're aware of how the aesthetic and the beautiful is styled and used for ideological purposes too. So, yeah, but there are lots of artists, I think, in the book. It's not an anti-aesthetic book.
No.
It's not a,
But there have been a lot. I mean, I'm interested in the part of what's beautiful about this book is you track the changing significance of key terms for a variety of artists. Like, we could think about the changing valence of the aesthetic, but also practices like appropriation. Right. Like, the book is super eloquent about changes in appropriation. Could you tell us a little bit about what appropriation meant for you in the 80s? And what appropriation seems to mean in the contemporary art that deploys it?
Another really easy question, it's a tricky question in the present. Obviously, there are a few artists and a few critics here. Maybe I can use them as lifelines for my own generation, who could say more than perhaps I can. I mean, for us, we can loosely say that we are the pictures generation. That kind of work was seen to be appropriation art. That was a term very much in circulation. It's actually a term I prefer for many reasons. And it was absolutely fundamental to the practices of so many artists in my world, my milieu. Again, you can see it in work of Sarah Charlesworth. And it had everything to do, again, this is where our concern, our critique of the aesthetic and the beautiful came in. It had everything to do with a suspicion about originality, uniqueness, a word that you don't hear much anymore, aura. So again, we were almost too eager to cook up a Molotov cocktail of Benjamin and Derrida and use it to attack these other terms, these other values. And appropriation was the primary device to promulgate this attack, this critique. So that was appropriation then, and its root is about the proper, about property. We wanted to question these things, and now it's an ethical caution, maybe a political tripwire. In a way, the very thing that we wanted to question, work as property, art as property, expression as property, identity as property, has become a thing to defend, and a place where one should not trespass. Literally. That's said all too schematically. I get the force of the contemporary critique of appropriation totally, but it's another term that's really spun around in the last 40 years.
But I think part of the power of the book is it renews the energies of that initial critical force of appropriation. It doesn't claim we should go back to exactly that understanding, but it also gives you a language to push against the orthodoxies of the present. It gives me a language to push against the idea that appropriation is always cultural theft and that culture is a closed sphere and so on. I want to ask you one last question about the reflection, the essay reflecting on the anti-aesthetic, which is just, you have this line in it where you say that in some ways, because we haven't talked about the subtitle of the anthology as much, but you have a line in the last essay in the new book that you say, in some ways, postmodernism seems more historical than modernism. And I think in that context, you mean historical in the sense of like distant from us. And I just wondered if you would elaborate that sentiment a little bit.
I'd love an easy question here sometime. Wow, multiple choice even. Yeah, why? I don't know if this is strictly true. It's not true historically, obviously, but I think for many of us, modernism has come back with a real force due to new ideas of what modernity was all about, new ideas of the way in which it was completely bound up with imperialism and colonialism. So the whole project to decolonize our understanding of modernism seems urgent. Sadly, I think postmodernism was taken up almost immediately as a stylistic term, and then really as a cultural industrial term, rubric. It was produced, it was put out there by different artists, different critics, in a very different guise originally. For me, we can get into the critical theoretical affiliations of us back then, but for me personally, I was formed, I think, in the Hegelian Marxist line of people like Lukács and de Boer. Frederick Jameson was very important to me. And I was really taken when Jameson, very early on, and this was in the anthology, The Anti-Aesthetic, when he proposed that we think about postmodernism as a way to periodize culture in relation to capitalism. And, that kind of opened up the concept for people like me. And in that regard, I think it still has real force. Maybe it speaks to a particular moment still, but maybe we can periodize it away in a different way, but just to treat it as simply a stylistic term was always reductive to me. Yeah. And especially as it was promoted in postmodern architecture, I was never happy with the idea.
You mentioned a few of the critics that mattered to you there, and I can't remember if you say this in one of the essays or have just said it in conversation, but at one point you refer to yourself as I don't know if this is an easier question or not, but the unhappy child. You're speaking of kind of your cohort and generation. You're the kind of the unhappy child of Warhol and Judd, talking about the importance of pop and minimalism and your formation. Can you talk about? You could talk just about pop and minimalism. You could talk about why it was unhappy. Were there any happy memories in that family?
I mean, again, we were kids, but not just kids the way that Patti Smith was just kids. She was, she was very anti-Warhol. The line that I remember from her book was, I didn't like the soup and I hated the can. We were quite opposite. I mean, I was completely enthralled to Warhol. And I think that, pictures people, had to figure out a way to work after Warhol in a way that was, that allowed for how important he was for us, but also opened up another space. But why were we unhappy? We were unhappy because they were too much with us in a way. I mean, Warhol was very much around. So was Judd. And like any new group in town, we wanted space. Our love was mixed with not hate, but criticism for sure. But just, why unhappy children, or why children, maybe I'll bracket the unhappy. Gerhard Richter once said that minimalism set a new alphabet for art. And I think that's right. It set a serial logic for work that was hard, not to take on. Charles Ray once said to me that Judd proposed a whole new geometry of viewing, that you couldn't install work in the old ways after you saw a Judd exhibition. So I think I agree with both ideas. I mean, just both internally to the work and as it exists in space, it set up a new logic, a new language, and one could go with it, one could push against it, one could break with it, but you were in reaction to it somehow. And with Warholian pop in particular, it had everything to do with the seductions of the image and how one couldn't help as a TV generation kid, one couldn't help but be both seduced and suspicious of the image. And we would talk forever about what degree we were critical, what degree complicit. I mean, that some people here will remember that mantra. Is it critique or is it complicity? It was that was really the test. So obviously the image is much transformed, but I think those two proposals, and I don't think it's just a historical accident or biographical accident that they were what's was on when I was first formed by art, I think that they continue to be structurally important, those concerns. So.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is kind of behind some of these genealogies we're talking about are shifting relations to the real, which you've obviously written very influentially about. And, that pop is both complicit and critical of spectacle, and that the notion of reality kind of, you track changes in the notion of reality. Could you talk, this is the last big genealogical question. Is no one else interested in this stuff? This is like what I go to Hal Foster for, but now I feel like I'm ruining our friendship.
I'll be the judge of that.
but I mean, I've learned so much from you about different notion, like thinking about, the pop relation to spectacle and the image that you're talking about, and then what you see as like a more contemporary relationship to the problem of the real and how we got there. Because those concepts and insights are characteristic of new art that you're writing about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. How to go about it? I think, one cliche of postmodernism and poststructuralism is that the real is gone, is it subsumed in representation, or less a less Baudrillardian take on the problem. The real is always constructed, and that was a truth or a para-truth that we took on, people like me took on. And I think it allowed for a form of critique, often deconstructive in art and criticism. That was important. I don't regret it. I think that was posed and played with and eventually played out in many ways. It was played out in part because the real is also what does not go away. The real is history, and history bites. The real bites. And in a way, there was a shift. It's stupid to talk about it in terms of decades, but as we move through the 1980s with the attack really on society, the neoliberal, there is no such thing as society attack on society. There was a fraying of the social, the welfare state. Deregulation began to be everywhere. Not like it is today, but it was just still, it seemed like it was everywhere. And there was the AIDS epidemic. So suddenly the reals seemed to be dramatic, not merely constructed. I mean, so in a way, trauma crashed into construction in relation to models of the real. I remember, for me, it was almost a traumatic moment when this happened. I had gone to the Warhol Museum just when it opened, the early 1990s, I think, and in Pittsburgh, and I was stuck in a snowstorm, and I, carried around the old idea of Warhol as, there's nothing in the work, it's all surface, nothing in me, I'm all surface. I took that line, but I hung out. I had to hang out in the museum for hours, and I was really struck by how the work didn't really match up to that argument, that it pushed back on our own critical model, and that it was really riven in its repetitions by kind of rips of the image that seemed to allow the real to come through. And I think in that moment, that semi-traumatic moment, I had an idea about dramatic realism that also seem to speak to contemporary practices. I mean, this is a moment when figurations, really disfigurations of the body were very prevalent. You think about Robert Gober or Kiki Smith, and it seemed to have everything to do with, people in pain, a body politic in trouble. And it wasn't just simply, we'll just show how the real is imaged, show how the real bites us, kills us. Now, as I mentioned, I think the traumatic has become, in a way, normative too, as a means to think about almost everything, subjectivity, history. So one wants to think otherwise, but I think we've also suffered through not only deconstructions of the real, but derealizations of the real everywhere. So in a way, we want the real back. And what I see is, art and work, this is over the last 10, 15, 20 years, that wants to produce real effects again, to make the real feel like the real again. I mean, I see it in your work, the way that you use repetition sometimes, not to suggest that everything is a representation, but to somehow get at the real again. There's a desire to kind of make it effective again, on the one hand, and then in other practices, a desire to kind of reconstruct it almost forensically against all the derealizations, all the false news, alternative facts of our world.
Well, I think about like your writing about Ed Atkins and the kind of human showing up in the glitch as in these video, these videos that are totally the constructedness of the real is a given, but
Right.
You pinpoint these moments that there's a kind of glitch in which the human returns, which is not unrelated to what you're saying about Warhol and the tear in an image through which the traumatic comes through.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is an idea I might have stolen from you because we saw the work together.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an artist, extraordinary artist, English artist, who's, I think next week opens a retrospective at Tate Britain, who's very interested in how intensive mediation now might be a way to allow the real back in through glitches. He calls it media corpsing, the moment when technology fails. When you hear the buzz in a recording, or when your movie buffers, but he makes it his practice. That's one dimension, one idea of failure that I wanted to get across. There's another artist right now that I write about in the book who's a show in the East Village right now, Mungo Thompson. I really recommend people go see it. It's at Karma. He's also very interested in these media glitches. Takes instructional manuals and mediates them to the point where rather than how to, they become how not to, so that it's that kind of motivation of failure that I mean to evoke in the book as well.
Yeah. I'm going to ask two more really big questions and then we can open it up and I'll get out of the way. But one...
Can I ask you a question or two?
No. One, I mean, you can, but let me ask this one first because I'm really curious about what we're here. I want to hear from you more, but here's the question I have. So I feel like you have helped me think about this weird thing about being like a contemporary art historian, which always sounds, it always sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, doesn't it?
Tell me about it.
Yeah, right. So, but one of the things that you've written about in different ways in different places, you both in what you practice and how you write, there's a kind of difference for you you can correct all these terms if they're wrong, but a difference between historicizing artworks, right, and making clear the field of something about the field of relations in which they exist, and historicism, where a critic might tell a story about the history of art that's prescriptive about practice in the present, and that has some teleology, and that might kind of give implicit instructions about what the next permissible move is in the unfolding of art history. And one of the things I admire about this book, your work, is that I think you're really on the side of the historicizing and not the historicism. But I'm actually not sure if you think that, or if you think that you've ever succumbed to the temptations of the historicism and not the historicizing.
Yikes. Yeah, I mean, historicism is another one of these really bad words, bad objects. I mean, this is another thing that came through Benjamin, his extraordinary critique of historicism as, simply a causal chain of influence. It's there in his final essay. And then there was the pronouncement of Frederick Jameson in The Political Unconscious, 1981, first lines, always historicize. And so that opposition was really in play for us. But truth be told, I'm not a person who always historicizes. My motto is just as much always theorize, too. I think there's no conflict between, say, an investigation that's concerned with how art or literature signifies and how it is formed in its moment historically, which is the project to historicize. So for me, the opposition of a semiotic approach and a social historical approach, they were given to me as, you had to choose. For me, they were never in opposition, because, I was always really taken by this great line from Barthes, who said, one must attend to the historical responsibility of forms. And, which you have to be concerned with history and you have to be concerned with form. And it's not as if history is not in the form, it is. So you have to know how it signifies, how it is structured. And I know you know all this. But, the project, and I think this is true for many of us, some of us here, for me, it was always really important to triangulate criticism, history, and theory. And this is where I was so committed to contemporary art, but less so now. I don't pretend to know it fully. I mean, how could one? But what I often have so appreciated about contemporary practice, apart from all its own wonders, is that it opens up new ideas, new historical projects. And, it wouldn't, I don't think, if I didn't come to it in both a semiotic and social historical way at the same time. I mean, there's so much more I want to say about it, about that question, but I don't want to bore everybody. But
I'm going to ask you one more question. I don't know if this book is here, but this is a great book. This is where Hal interviews Benjamin Buchloh. It's called Exit Interview. It reads like a Thomas Bernhard novel, basically. But
that's a great blurb, Ben.
Yeah, I want to ask you one of the questions. Wait, did I write down? I haven't looked at my notes yet, but one.
That was his title. Benjamin wanted that title. I just want to say.
Yeah.
I'm on the off ramp, not at the exit.
Well, by no means are you at the end of anything, but this I'm curious if you think this question that you asked him applies to you, and you can choose to either answer it, or I'll be interested in the terms of your refusal. The first line of your question is, "But once again, you've deflected my question." And then Hal throws a bottle across the room or something. But once again, you've deflected my question, you say to Buclos, which is addressed to your own practice as a critic and a historian, but also as a teacher and an advisor. When I started out in this country, there was no such thing as contemporary art history, but now there is, abundantly so. And in fact, you have taught, as have I, some of the key figures in this new field, not only at our universities, but also at the Whitney Independent Study Program, which you write beautifully about in this book. Not only at our universities, but also at the Whitney Independent Study Program, and we have published many of them in October as well. My question then is this: how, as a profoundly anti-institutional critic and historian, do you reflect both on your part in the institutionalizing of artists and critics, and on your status as a critical institution in your own right? You wrote that quote. That's your...
Yeah, but it was addressed to Buclos. Yeah, there's so many ways to deny.
Well,
First of all, yeah, you can take the question back.
No, I'm not going to take it back. I'm just going to say, like, I think it's important. Like, when we began our conversation talking about like the anti-aesthetic, you were not in a university.
No,
there was no global art market. You were very much at a kind of margin, and for all kinds of reasons, some of which that have to do with the achievement of your writing, and some that have to do with the reconfiguration of these institutions, I don't think you would think of yourself as at a margin. And you've been influential in all these ways. So,
Thank you.
You've had a great career.
You really know how to make a guy feel horrible. Yeah, I mean, when I came to New York, I was a college kid, mid-1970s, and then after the late 1970s, the city was bankrupt, it was cheap. We could all live within a certain radius of each other. We could hang out, but more importantly, we were still downtown. I mean, I felt more affinity in my generation to the New York, say, the generation of Paula, than to the generations now. It was just a different setup, and contemporary art was not taught in the university. Critical theory was not taught in the university. Some of us, did a pass at Columbia because Edward Said had a course on the Frankfurt School, and we learned a little bit about Benjamin, a little bit about Adorno, and then he began to teach the French a little bit, but told us a little bit about Foucault and a little bit about Derrida. Sauveur L'Étranger was there too, and he brought in a different configuration. Deleuze and Guattari, for example. So it wasn't completely absent, but you really had to seek it out. So neither my interest in contemporary art nor my interest in critical theory was at all academic. And you could still be kind of a residual wannabe New York intellectual in that situation. You didn't have to be in the academy. I mean, I worked at Art in America from 1981 to 1987, then I worked at the Whitney program for 4 years. And it wasn't until the late 1980s, early 1990s, that there was a place at all for what people like me or Buchloh or Douglas Crimp or Craig Owens did. I mean, that's not to be romantic about it, it's just to tell you what it was. And that was, the art market had begun to take over the art world. So in a way, the Academy was a sanctuary. It wasn't, it was not a capitulation. It was a sanctuary. And there were all, that said, that was decades ago now. And, I do teach and write at the center, a very privileged place, very privileged university. And I don't do much work in the margins. It's not the kind of critic historian that I am. I value that work, but because I am at a center, I feel that if I can position or revalue what goes on there a little bit with colleagues and students, that's critical work carried on. I still think that there's a certain politics of theory in the academy, and I wonder how it'll be played out in the conditions we are under now. But yeah, I mean, I think we were surprised that we were taken up at that moment. This idea that we are somehow institutions, maybe that makes sense, and maybe I would validate it if that would be a way for people to question and critique us, and God knows that has happened. For me, the academic is not necessarily a bad word, at least not now. It amazes me that the right wants to go after one of the few places that liberals and indeed leftists have a purchase. They can't even leave us that little space. But that's our situation now. So in a way, it might reanimate the politics of all these discussions. I certainly hope so.
I think it's time to hear the questions from the audience for Hal.
Or for Ben.
No, just for Hal.
Very quickly, before we do that, I do want to ask you, hard question, how does art figure in your writing? Because I know it does, and I know it does in the generation of authors. Katie Kitamura is here, it does in her work. And this is just different from my generation of writers. There are a few exceptions, like DeLillo was always interested in contemporary art. Others were informed, but they were somewhat Philistine about it all. People like you, Katie, Zadie Smith, Hari Kunzru, Rachel Kushner, I could go on.
Yeah.
It means a lot to you, not only art, critical theory too. I mean, how did that happen? Why did it turn?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd love to hear Katie's answer to that question. I would say one thing for me is that, what appeals to me about the novel is that it's a curatorial form, and that you can dramatize encounters with other artworks, and that it can, and that whether they're poems or kinds of visual art, but also that critics like you, Tim Clark, others who let in to criticism all this stuff that I thought you had to bracket from the artistic experience. Like novels let in a lot, right? They let you be very unprofessional, and you're thinking about art and value. it can matter, if someone's looking at the painting and is heartbroken or has this or that drug in their system or past whatever protest en route to the encounter in the museum. So since it was a way to be an art critic by other means, but also to admit a lot of the other stuff that's in my head when we look at things together that isn't professionally relevant to conventional criticism. But also I think I'm just, I'm really interested in the kind of experience a museum or a gallery seems to have prepared for you, and whether or not I'm having the right or wrong experience, and what that says about me or what that says about the value of the work or the culture in which the exhibition has been mounted. And all those things ramify out in novels and can become rich technologies of characterization in other ways or something. So those are some of the things that pop in my mind. But I don't know, that's the most the thing you're asking about, like why that's true of a lot of different writers now and how new that is a really interesting question. I mean, it probably also has something to do with thinking about the real, and the way you're describing that. If you reflect on an encounter with an artwork, you also are reflecting on the terms of the artwork the novel is, and so it lets you think about the framing of the real in the work, something like that. But
this is why it's so much fun to look at art with you. I mentioned DeLillo as an exception, but the primary exception is Lynn Tillman, of course.
Yeah, it's an important exception.
Who hung in there with us from the beginning, and her fiction and her criticism, counted so much for all of us. So she is an exception to the exception to the generational rule, if it is such. Anyway, any questions for you all? Comments?
Hi, I have a very simple question. So I'm really curious about the new doubts you have while writing the book. What are you suspicious of now that you weren't before you wrote the book?
Well, maybe I should have said, in a way, Terrence said what I was about to say about the book, that it's it's a selection of 40 texts from about 25 years. So, and part of the title for me is that an essay is always an attempt, a failed attempt. So in some of the texts, I try again and fail again. But some I leave as they were, as documents of failure. Because I often think that books are almost too perfect and that there's not a way to get into them because everything is considered, everything is written. So, I think anybody who revises work or chooses not to revise work, you have to think about the suspicions you have about your own work. And I'm okay with failure. I think failure does count as a success. We didn't even talk about political failure, because I get more out of failure, even my own failures. And I think it opens it up for others, for readers. I say to my students, I think I write this in the book, that I tell them, don't follow my lead. If you're interested at all in what I do, look for my blind spots and go there. So that's how I think about it. Dude.
First of all, thank you so much, both of you. That was fascinating. But my question is if you would care at all how to speculate on the impact of the market on theoretical or critical approaches, because I was struck in a way that the market came in kind of only at the end, almost biographically, in terms of your, leaving the art market for the academy. But for me, when I heard the terminology used early, the aesthetic, aura, and the desire to oppose that, it was sort of, it could be a code for market value too. And when I think about the failure of some of that sort of first generation appropriation work, I do think about sort of the broad intellectual shifts you're sketching out, but I also really think about the market's kind of unbelievable ability to assimilate, maybe not appropriate, but to just absorb that work so smoothly. And I'm wondering, I mean, maybe that's boring because it's so obvious, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts of whether that failure is as much kind of market driven as some kind of, structural problem with the theoretical approach.
You mean the art in particular, or also the criticism, or what?
I guess all of them. Maybe first the art. That's, I guess, my primary question. Is it seems like the art project failed for those reasons. But then, as you as a critic, sort of, if that shifted your thinking as much as anything else, or maybe it didn't.
Yeah, I guess I am a little suspicious of terms like assimilation, commodification. I understand them, I use them, co-option, because they're so total. Sure, artists like many of the pictures people, Sarah Charlesworth, are taken up to a degree, but in a way, Sarah had to be recovered and reanimated by the gallery here. It's not a total process, and it's not forever. But yeah, I get it. I think it's almost, I know you don't do this, because I know you, Julian, but I think, we go to that model too quickly, and that allows us not to see what can still be drawn from work. It's criticality, it's rebarbative moments, it's opaque moments, and there was never a market for theory. There was a way in which theory became its own academic niche market. But the market is also a means of circulation, and it can be used in different ways. And even as successful an artist, say, as Cindy Sherman or Louise Lawler, continue to make work that I still find rebarbative in ways. What I think we didn't talk about, and I just want to mention here, and it's not so much about market value, but it is about cultural value, cultural capital. There's a way in which there was a certain displacement from political progressivism into art. The generation of the 1930s, they morphed into the 40s and 50s. I mean, Clement Greenberg has a famous line about this. He almost admits to this displacement. But for my generation, there was a further displacement from art into theory. That theory became the avant-garde, for many of us in the 1970s and 1980s. And there was a way in which there was a certain market for it now, an academic market that bled out, beyond the academy. And the old concern about theory as press release, sure, that happened. But was that the end of it? I don't think so.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to sort of riff on the title, which obviously has Beckett behind it, and his brilliant sort of use of semi-repetition and humor, maybe. And I wanted to ask both of you how much fun you guys are having with your work. And actually sort of how comedy or even irony does heavy lifting in what you're really saying. Both of you.
Well, it's easy. I mean, it's easier to be. It's easier to be funny when you're writing a kind of text. If you're in a genre that has no professional or scholarly responsibilities, but I think that humor. I mean, I think that the humor that's produced by a kind of, you know, a strategic disappointment of expectations or whatever, like, and the little spark of a recognition of a space between, you know, the real and the possible is really foundational to, I mean, I think it would just, without that, I don't know how one would go on. And I do think Beckett is a figure of that, for me anyway, yeah.
You know, our art sorties with Jeff Dolvin, they are like a Beckett play often. I mean, it's a threesome. But we laugh grimly all the time, precisely because you know, we fail the work more than it fails us, and we can't figure it out. We can't figure each other out. But it's great, nonetheless. I think, you know, Ben has a terrific essay called Hatred of Poetry. And one of my questions was, could you apply that same logic to art? You know, that the idea in the book, let me butchered for you, is that some of us come to poetry with such hope, you know, that we cannot help but be disappointed. And you can use this idea as a way to think about, you know, the status of poetry, and maybe art is just in another space. But for us, I mean, for Jeff, Ben, and I, when we go out, it's really the comedy of art. You know, it's, you know, literally in the sense of comedy, a la Beckett. It's never a tragedy when we go out. Although the Friedrich show was a tragedy for us, I have to say.
Yeah, that was a hard afternoon. So. Why was the Friedrich show?
Wait for our review. I mean, everyone loves the Friedrich show, so I don't want to ruin it for anyone. But see me later in private. I think we've reached the
Yeah, I think we
appointed hour, right?
we should applaud Hal and buy his
bet.
book.
Okay. This got me through the home stretch of transcription. Oh, really?